Thank you. As the third presenter and the debater of this section, I would like to introduce Jason N. Kroll, who is professor of the National Taiwan University, and Dr. Kyung-Soo Kim, who is the senior research fellow of the Institute for National Security Strategy.
Hello everyone, my name is Jason Guo, an assistant professor of political science from National Taiwan University. I'm glad to be here to share with you my thoughts on COVID-19 and Northeast Asian Security Order. As we all know, COVID-19 is a historically unprecedented global shock to every country in the world. Even President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, was tested positive for COVID-19. Beyond a single case, there have been over 7 million Americans tested positive for COVID-19, and over 200,000 Americans died for COVID-19. East Asian countries have done a much better job than the United States, as statistics from Johns Hopkins University show here. East Asian countries have fewer number of confirmed cases and deaths than the United States. So, has COVID-19 brought about any change in Northeast Asian Security Order? In this presentation, security is broadly defined following the Copenhagen School. More specifically, it is defined as the existential threat to the health of individuals. With this broad conceptualization of security, public health crisis is not just public health, but a security issue. This allows us to incorporate COVID-19 into our analysis of Northeast Asian Security Order. Before moving to my own analysis, I would like to give you an overview of the emerging IR literature on COVID-19. Leading scholars of international relations have written on the topic. Most of them focus on the disruption of global supply chain by the COVID-19, or the global governance failure within World Health Organization during the global pandemic. And still others may dispute with each other with regard to whether COVID-19 is an event that will fundamentally change world politics. But the bottom line is that none of the above focuses on Northeast Asian Security Order. In what follows, I will divide my analysis into three parts. The first is the description of the pre-pandemic security order in this region. Then I will talk about East Asian responses to the pandemic. Then we're building on the second session to envision possible post-pandemic security order in Northeast Asia. First, let's look at the pre-pandemic security order. So few would dispute with me that Northeast Asia as a region has increasingly high level of economic integration despite persistently low-level security cooperation. Since the end of World War II, trade and investment have been the driving engine of economic growth in the region. This is how we have East Asian economic miracle, or so-called Asian tigers of South Korea and Taiwan. Later, China emerged as the world's factory that attracted investments from Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea to export manufacturing goods to the US and the rest of the world. Then it comes with China's economic rise. Yet, political conflicts between East Asian countries have been impediments to cooperation on managing external security threats within the region. This is because these countries are adherent to the norm of sovereignty and historically disputed territorial integrity. For instance, territorial disputes over Diaoyu Senkaku Island often trigger concerns over Japan's military expansion. Secondly, Chinese and Korean civil wars that divided their respective nations by different developmental ideologies have never settled permanently. With Taiwan's democratization, this gets even more complicated. Thirdly, China's maritime ambition in the East and South China Sea became increasingly clear. This also triggered growing political tensions between the United States and China. Then the pandemic occurred, or COVID-19 hit the world. The nature of the pandemic is best viewed as a transnational security threat, because the enemy is not a state or any particular organization, but the virus. Yet, despite the common interest in controlling the pandemic for internal security, no collective action between East Asian states has been achieved. Instead, most governments have adopted stringent measures to contain the spread of novel coronavirus unilaterally. They place international travel bans alone. They close business and shut down schools alone. A research team from Oxford University tried to collect information about government response to COVID-19 and recode them by the level of stringency to develop this index. Government Response Stringency Index. I select a sample of East Asian countries plus the United States and plot the evolution of Government Response Stringency Index for these countries over time. So the x-axis represents the time and the y-axis represents the level of stringency of government response. As you can see here, the key message is that there was apparently no policy coordination in terms of controlling COVID-19. Each country had has its own pace and make its own decision. Of course, stringent regulations to control COVID-19 have economic cost. With these stringent measures adopted by governments around the world, even most globalized firms are getting used to economic decoupling from each other, especially China within the region. These developments have consequences. So the post-pandemic security order, in my view, is twofold. First, the post-pandemic process of economic disintegration will make multilateral cooperation on transnational security issues within the region much more problematic than before. There will be no hope anymore for functionalist spillover, because the trend of economic integration is reversed. So there is little hope for the spillover effect of economic integration on security, cooperation, and even political integration. The long absence of regional security organization is likely to continue in Northeast Asia. Relatively, this post-pandemic process of economic disintegration will slow down China's economic rise. It also put pressure on China's economic growth. Together, they will shape the mutual anticipation of the US-China strategic rivalry. Secondly, because those stringent measures to control COVID-19 have economic cost, there will be post-pandemic competition for government-led economic recovery in East Asia. Especially these first-mover developmental states will compete for recovery more than before. There's going to be a competition for who open borders safer and faster. Also, these East Asian developed states are speeding up vaccine development. As you all know, currently China has developed 4 out of the 9 vaccines already moved to phase 3. Japan and South Korea, as well as Taiwan, are working hard to catch up. Together, these will transform the nature of the East Asian interrelations to be more competitive. And this competitive nature of East Asian relations will make security cooperation even more difficult. In sum, if we go back to our initial question that has COVID-19 brought about any change in Northeast Asian security order, A short answer is no. No major change. COVID-19 has no direct impact on Northeast Asia Security Order. Those East Asia development states compete to deal with the transnational security threat as usual. They do not cooperate despite the common fate. They are used to work alone. Also, the power transition between the US and China through economic globalization has become a bit more ambiguous than before because of the economic decoupling and disruption of global supply chain. One may argue that, but how can we explain growing tensions in Korean Peninsula and across the Taiwan Strait? I would argue, though, those tensions are driven by domestic political actors and their interactions, not the pandemic per se. So, the self-help remains self-help in Northeast Asia, as COVID-19 has brought about no fundamental change in Northeast Asian security order. But my analysis has one caveat. While I argue no direct impact of COVID-19 on Northeast Asian security order, it's possible that the impact may be indirect. For example, COVID-19 may change the US policy toward Asia through the defeat of Donald J. Trump, as voters try to punish Trump for his administration's failure to govern or control COVID-19. Currently, President Trump was tested positive for COVID-19, and the results of the upcoming U.S. election becomes very uncertain. How things would go will determine the future of Northeast Asian security order. Okay, thank you so much.
Hello everyone, my name is Kyung-Soo Kim. I am a research fellow at Institute for National Security Strategy. Thank you very much for inviting me to such a prominent international academic conference under the theme of changes in international order and national management strategies in post-COVID-19 era. And also I would like to thank so much to Director Ik-Soo Kim and Professor Kang-Kyu Nam. The topic I will be discussing today is COVID-19 and Northeast Asian Security Order, presented by Professor Kuo. Professor Kuo examined the post-pandemic security order in the perspective of the multilateral cooperation on transnational security threat. Professor Kuo's question is that what COVID-19 pandemic has brought any change in Northeast Asian security order, and says the environment for security order brought by COVID-19 pandemic is unfriendly to the multilateral cooperation on transnational security threat. On the premise that the environment for security order brought by COVID-19 pandemic might work for increasing the possibility of multilateral cooperation of India, Japan, and Australia in East Asia. I would like to have the picture of the post-pandemic security order of East Asia in detail. The COVID-19 pandemic has hit global trade and supply chains at an unprecedented speed and scale. The global COVID-19 pandemic has provided the occasion of grave significance to the many countries, which belong to the global supply chains by China, to realize the costs, both economic and security, of heavy dependence on the China. The shutdown of key manufacturing hubs in China sent shock waves throughout the global supply chains. As mentioned by Professor Kuo, without the diversification of global supply chain, most of countries would be exposed to problems caused by exclusive over-reliance on China. To reduce the risk of the over-dependence on a single market and vulnerabilities in the global economy, the United States and its allies have concerted efforts to find new ways, such as economic disintegration, decoupling from China, and alternative the global chains of supply. I expect the ongoing pandemic will make countries in the region accelerate to diversify their global supply chains, which exerted influence of much significance on the East Asian security environment. This trend will weaken the Chinese influence on South Korea with economic leverage. Previously, heavy dependence to the Chinese market has made Korea difficult to be free from the economic damage from third economic retaliation by China. It was a tipping point for South Korea to pursue hedging strategy in a way of economic disintegration from China. Professor Kuo presented signals that COVID-19 pandemic will impact indirectly on East Asian security order in the future, but he didn't explain in detail. The process of diversification of global supply chains and decoupling from China will work for creating the environment which is the importance of South Korea, India, Japan, and Southeast Asian countries as more significant players in the region would be increased. It would provide the soil for multilateral cooperation of India, Japan, Australia, and Southeast Asian countries in the Indo-Pacific region, as well as bilateral cooperation between South Korea and Taiwan to prepare for potential disruption in the future. We witnessed the Blue Dot Network and EPN, Economic Prosperity Network, pushed by U.S. in East Asia. Companies in the U.S. plan to continue moving supply chains out of China regardless of who wins the presidential election, Biden or Trump. From a security perspective, the COVID-19 pandemic served to exacerbate the existing strategy uncertainties in the region. As 4 Indo-Pacific nations, known as the Quad, will increase the efforts to strengthen ties. East Asia will witness the growth of the tension between China and the Quad led by US. The pandemic has accelerated that trend and aggravated the pre-existing conditions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. As the first presenter and debater of this section, I would like to introduce Andrei Rankov, who is a professor of Kookmin University, and Dr. Bernhard Zalog, who is representative of Hans Seidel Stephen Korea.
Well, right now, North Korea is fighting what can be described a perfect storm. And the COVID pandemics plays a major role in these developments. It's probably one of the major reasons, actually the major reason, but not the only reason why North Korea is now facing what is probably the most difficult year in Kim Jong-un's, say, in roughly decade of Kim Jong-un's rule. Well, probably we should remember that just 2 years ago, actually 1.5 years ago, in early 2019, the North Korean leaders seemingly had some grounds for optimism. First, they learned how to manage Donald Trump. When Donald Trump was elected the US president in 2016, he faced the North Korean military provocations, the ICBM launches, and nuclear tests. And for a brief while, it did look like that he was going to deliver a preemptive strike. Actually, it was not what the North Koreans initially expected, but they gradually adjusted to the new challenge. They learned how to, if you like, manage Donald Trump, how to avoid a serious confrontation. They had a chain of summits, they made promises they probably were not going to keep and did not really intend to keep, and they basically saved time. Won time. It was their first goal. So in 2017 they could basically say that they almost knew how to handle Donald Trump. Then, until February 2019, there was a great deal of optimism about Hanoi summit. It was widely expected in Pyongyang that the US would accept their proposal, that Donald Trump would agree to swap a part of the North Korean nuclear program for sanctions relaxation. Finally, the economy between 2012 and 2017, 5-6 years, was doing well. And even though sanctions had impact on the economic situation, the North Korean decision makers were certainly sure that a Hanoi deal would be done and things will recover. But all this was wrong, because the next year, year 2020, was the year of very bad news. Still in late 2019, at his speech at the Korean Workers' Party Central Committee, Kim Jong-un still behaved as everything was quite normal. He actually, in late 2019, the North Koreans proclaimed that the 1st of January 2020 would be a deadline for their restraint policy. They did not say openly, but they hinted many times that early this year, early 2020, North Korea would restart its ICBM testing and maybe nuclear testing. However, this did not happen. And things went, which were quite bad in 2019, went much worse in late January, when North Korea was hit by the COVID epidemics. The reaction was quite dramatic, as you know. But in order to make sense of it, we have to keep in mind that, historically speaking, the North Korean government has always been in a great fear of the epidemics. Every time somewhere in the world some epidemic outbreaks happen, the North Korean government reacts by introducing a very costly quarantine. Sometimes such measures might make sense. Sometimes they look quite irrational. For example, in 2002, when there was SARS epidemics, it was still the days of Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-un was not obviously even considered to be a possible successor, but nonetheless the country introduced very severe quarantine. In 2014, late 2014, under Kim Jong-un's rule, North Korea reacted in the same way to the outbreak of Ebola fever in Africa. Ebola fever is indeed a very dangerous disease, but it happened far, far away. And finally, in 2015, they had a massive strict quarantine during the MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome epidemics. So what we see now is pretty standard reaction. Once an outbreak of some strange disease happens somewhere, North Koreans always closing their borders, stopping tourism, and isolating foreigners. These are standard procedures for North Korea. So, when they learned about COVID epidemics, in late January they learned about COVID epidemics, and from the last days of January the North Korean official media began to run reports about the situation in China. Interestingly enough, even Nodon Sinmun explicitly stated that, according to the foreign scholars, as they said, foreign scientists, there are reasons to doubt the officially published Chinese statistics. So essentially the North Koreans admitted that Chinese statistics was probably wrong, underreported. It's not clear whether it was the case, but it's remarkable that it was said in the North Korean media in the very first days of the epidemics. In the early days of February, the communication with the outside world was essentially stopped. Arguably, North Korea now is executing the tightest quarantine regime you can find anywhere in the world. Since early February, all connection with the outside world was stopped, and only occasionally a small number of evacuation operations were conducted. Such operations were aimed at getting some foreigners, largely diplomats and aid workers, out of North Korea. Those foreigners who are staying in the country, largely diplomats, were cut off all contacts they used to have, even though their initial contacts were extremely limited. Interestingly, many embassies and aid agencies reacted to the new situation by withdrawing a significant part of their personnel, or sometimes closing down completely, like, say, the British Embassy, which ceased to be operational, and a number of other smaller embassies. So, the cross-border trade went down dramatically. It's not possible to clearly distinguish to which extent the decline in the amount of cross-border trade was a result of quarantine measures and to what extent it was a part of sanctions. However, it's remarkable that not only regular trade was stopped. Measures were taken to stop smuggling, which for many years, have been tolerated or even quietly encouraged by the authorities. If we look at the market situation, we can see that to a very large extent, the price structure over the last few months indicates that the border is closed indeed. A good indicator is the price of items which, like say medical herbs, are produced or collected inside North Korea for exports. So if such stuff is sold domestically, it's usually sold to people who are going to buy it and then resell to China. And the price for such resale import-oriented items has gone down considerably. Special measures were taken to prevent any contact with the outsiders. When in June a former defector, a person who defected to South Korea, decided to redefect, such things do happen from time to time, he arrived to the city of Kaesong. And because there were some suspicions that he had a COVID, that he was a COVID case, special measures were taken. Essentially, even interaction, even communication between parts of Kaesong was stopped. Another good example of these events is an ugly incident which happened in late September with a South Korean official. In some unclear situation, did he do it himself or not? Was he going to commit suicide? Was he going to defect? Was it a kind of bad luck? At any rate, he found himself first at water of the Yellow Sea, and then after a long swim on the North Korean coast. Probably we have somewhat different reports of the incident. This South Korean official told North Korean border guards he was going to defect. They had some deliberations with their headquarters and then obviously received an order to shoot at him, to kill him, and he was killed while still in water. Most likely it was done as a precaution to prevent him from bringing, so to say, COVID inside the country, because on a recent military parade, Kim Jong-un proudly said that North Korea had no cases of COVID. According to some rumors, on the North Korean border guards stationed on the border with China also have instructions to shoot to kill at any person who is approaching the border areas. Why is such a fear, which is probably unprecedented? Frankly, it's more difficult to say than most people assume. It's often claimed that North Koreans are afraid of the epidemics because their country's medical system is so bad. But this is not the case. Yes, North Korea's medical system is bad. But if you compare North Korea not with rich countries of the developed world, but with countries with the same, roughly same level of per capita income, North Korea's health care system begins to look rather good. It's suffice to say that North Korea currently has about 30-35 doctors per 10,000 people, while Nepal, with roughly same income, a bit high income, has only 7. When it comes to the number of doctors per capita, North Korean level is surprisingly close to that of France. On top of that, the North Korean medical system can closely interact with police, and domestic quarantine policies are easy to arrange and likely to be efficient. Nobody is going to argue citing, say, privacy or individual rights. It's simply not a part of North Korean political vocabulary. Nonetheless, sanctions are undermining, the quarantine measures are seriously damaging the economy. And it's only part of the problem, because there is another problem, which is sanctions. Until early 2019, well, the sanctions, the current level of sanctions is truly unprecedented, and these sanctions were introduced only recently, largely in 2017. Until 2019, the North Korean leaders believed that they would get relief, they would get rid of sanctions, maybe partially, if they sacrifice a part of their nuclear and missile program, while keeping the rest indefinitely. However, it did not work out. The current position of the US is that nothing short of denuclearization, known as CVAD, complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization, will do. However, such a solution is completely unacceptable for the North Koreans, who believe it to be a kind of collective suicide. So, they are in a limbo. Sanctions are likely to stay. The compromise they hoped early last year is still possible, but it can be achievable only if Donald Trump remains a president. If Joe Biden becomes the next US president, sanctions will continue for a long time. And on top of the epidemics and sanctions, they also had natural disasters, typhoons, because in August and September, North Korea suffered from an unusually intense typhoon season. Usually, the North Korean media tends to exaggerate the material damage inflicted by the natural disasters. But this time it seems that the damage was real and indeed big, which was unusual. The North Korean media even reported some human casualties. So we have pandemics, we have sanctions, and we have natural disasters, all happening more at the same time. What will be the economic consequences? Well, no doubt that economic impact is going to be grim, but how grim is it going to be? Nobody knows yet. Because the first few years, say 5 or 6 years of Kim Jong-un's rule, were a period of remarkable economic growth, 5, 6, maybe 7% per year. It's not going anymore, it's not happening. This trend was actually reversed. There are first signs of the food difficulties. It's remarkable that in recent few months, the North Korean media is talking about, say, wonders of potato and other traditional subsistence food which normally North Koreans would not eat. Last time such talks could be noticed only about, say, in the early 2000s, when the food situation was not good. However, in spite of these economic problems, I would say that these economic difficulties probably will not lead to a political crisis. And the major reason for this is, of course, position of China. China's ongoing confrontation with the United States, it shows no signs of abating. And it means that now when China and and the United States are facing such a level of mutual distrust and contradictions, it means that the strategic value of North Korea for China has increased dramatically. In the new situation, China has all reasons to keep North Korea afloat, no matter how. And it's telling, for example, that in spite of all difficulties, the fuel prices in Seoul has been very stable. The only explanation is that there are significant shipments of fuel from China, which are not reported to the UN Security Council and all relevant agencies. And it's not just high probability, it's very high probability idea. It's probably the only way to explain why fuel prices in Pyongyang remain stable. And of course, fuel is just the first step. If food situation in North Korea gets really tough, if North Korea really faces a threat of famine, China will definitely ensure that no massive famine would happen. Thanks to the position of China, which needs a stable North Korea, a repetition of the arduous march with massive famine deaths is highly unlikely. China understands that famine constitutes a great threat to stability, and China now badly needs a stable North Korea. So, if things get really tough, China will rush to the rescue. And this new situation is not necessarily popular with Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un and his people don't necessarily like the return of China to the North Korean politics. Historically, since the early 1960s, North Korea has always preferred to deal with a number of quarreling great power sponsors because it gave North Korea ways to maneuver and adjust. However, now they have no choice. And at any rate, for the time being, the return of China to the Korean politics. The return was not quite voluntary, it was largely provoked by the trade war which was started by Donald Trump. However, for the time being, the return of China means that the North Korean government, in spite of the COVID, does not face an immediate security threat. It faces some economic threat, but with Chinese backing and with Chinese aid, these threats, economic threats, including threats of massive undernourishment and maybe even localized famines, these threats will be probably quite easily overcome. And at any rate, China will not allow it to develop into some kind of political crisis. So in essence, in spite of rather difficult situation North Korea finds itself in, the situation in and around North Korea is, I would say, frozen for the foreseeable future, and COVID epidemics is not changing much in this regard, even though it does create a great deal of pressure and might have some long-term impact on the political situation in the country, on the North Koreans' attitude to Kim Jong-un.
Dear Professor Nam, dear Professor Lankov, dear audience, I'm very happy to discuss today the paper of Professor Lankov, 2020, North Korea, Fighting a Perfect Storm in the Year of Plague, which certainly touches upon a very, very important topic and the question if North Korea will be brought into a major crisis through the triple crisis of COVID-19, ongoing sanctions, and the natural disaster which North Korea experienced in this autumn. This negative occurrences, as Professor Lankov admirably describes, are not all new. Regarding sanctions, after 2 years with plunging exports and basically stable imports, foreign currency seems to get scarce for the North Korean regime. And it seems to be that sanctions start biting the country. If we look, for example, at one of the most important, still most important exports, coal exports, which are now illegal, we can see that they may be through ship-to-ship transfers or through illegal shippings into China cover 10% of what they covered in the peak time of legal exports. COVID-19 led to a similar shutdown than previous epidemics, SARS, Ebola and MERS, but it will potentially be a much longer crisis, basically shutting down the whole economy and achieving what sanctions did not, namely effectively sealing the countries off from imports. Unfortunately, this includes inputs directly needed to maintain food security, like fertilizer. And there was a reason why the United Nations did not really want to shut down imports of goods important for food security, because it was an explicit goal stated by the United Nations that the food crisis should not come up or be the result of sanctions. Finally, the natural disasters have hit North Korea practically every year, but this summer season was one of the wettest seasons in almost 40 years. At least in one region, it was actually the wettest season since 1981, and bringing additionally widespread flooding. The effect of these negative developments might only be felt in the spring of 2021, when the lean season, that is the season after consuming the bulk of the harvest of this year, starts. North Korean leadership, in my opinion, seems to have quite a good understanding of these problems. At the military parade on October 10, Kim Jong-un shed tears due to the hardship for the people, and as Professor Lankov describes, articles in the official media of North Korea allude once again to the joys of basic foodstuff like potatoes, indicating how dire the situation is. Interestingly, while being outwardly optimistic, as Professor Lankov recalls, already in November and December last year, 2019, North Korea started a regular media campaign to propagate independence, that is autarky, on the provincial level. Especially Gangwon province was taken as an example. Gangwon province plays a very, very important role for propaganda in North Korea under Kim Jong-un, because it's something like his home province, his home turf. And there were numerous articles describing how Gangwon-do was a province fending for itself. And there was even an exhibition on Gangwon-do's autarky in the end of last year, where goods were shown which Gangwon-do produced, which it hadn't produced in the past. And not only that we talk about the provincial level, but we also found a lot of articles in the end of 2019 on autarky on the company level and even on the individual level. For example, stories about people who basically from nothing created a livestock farm, or have now 10 or 15 different kinds of domestic animals which they are raising additionally to their allocated jobs in the farm, etc. This shows that the current problem are like this perfect storm or a triple disaster coming together all, but that they were longer in preparation. Natural disasters were, the sanctions, which for some years could be fended off by simply overspending, by spending more money than earning money through exports, which plunged to almost zero. And also regarding the epidemic, there were the precedences. So all of this had been there before, but it all came together in 2020 to accumulate and to build certainly the gravest challenge for the future of North Korea since the famine of the 1990s. Professor Lankov ends by stating that the interest of China prevents North Korea from instability. However, while this might be true, there might also be, in my opinion, a different development. One question currently not clear is, what is the impact of US elections? If there's an ordered transition of power in the US, North Korea might try to test the new administration by firing the new extra-large missile, which they showed off in the Pyongyang parade in October 10th. That development has to come at some point when this new weapon has to be credibly acknowledged as something which already in 2019 again was announced by Kim Jong-un as the new strategic deterrent. But instead of leading to an opening up, this could also result in a stricter US attitude, especially if we had a Biden administration which is in need of gaining credibility as a tough negotiation partner who doesn't want to appear weak. And this maybe would have additional negative impact on North Korea, and the intended result to get sanctions relief might be far, far away in the future with this. A second question is how the new Sino-US Cold War develops and how this might change the Chinese calculation. If there is a solution of the US-China spat, or at least some relief, again, maybe by a transition of government in the US, this might make it easier for North Korea, in particular in terms of sanctions exemption, but it could also mean a loss of interest from the point of view of China into the buffer zone which North Korea's offer. So I'm not really sure if we can already conclude that North Korea is safe through these challenges. If we have an internal situation which is grave and maybe renewed food insecurity, then it depends a lot really on how external actors can approach North Korea and will approach North Korea to determine the stability. And certainly, while this year was a tragic year for the world and also for North Korea, next year will be exciting in seeing how this plays out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's close in the second section. Thank you for all presenters and debaters.